My name is Maureen Toohill. I'm town planner in the town of Littleton and also a CPTC board member. It gives me great pleasure to welcome three individuals offering their insight and knowledge and background on demystifying development. This session was given first at the CPTC annual conference. They'll be doing a slightly shortened version of the session this evening. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions at the end of the session as we can. Meanwhile, it's just 5 o'clock now. We have 24 attendees. So maybe we can slow play the introductions a little bit. But meanwhile, I'd be happy to turn it over to Jenny.
Great. Do you want to wait another minute, or do you want me to go ahead and get started?
Well, let's give it another minute and see how we do for people coming in.
See, we're up to 32 now, so people are coming in now.
Yeah.
Probably trying to find the Zoom link if they're like me.
Yeah.
I got to make it a better habit of putting it on the Zoom link on my calendar invite.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, so I can take care of a few administrative things. We can email a copy of the presentation to all attendees after the session is done. And we will make available a recording of this session on the CPTC website. It'll just take us a few days to get that compiled and posted. 38 attendees, so we're doing much better.
Great.
So I think you can, Jenny, I think you can go ahead and get started as soon as you're ready.
Okay, great. You put the slide up on the screen. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Demystifying Development, a peek behind the curtain of permitting projects. I'm Jenny Gingras, Director of Planning for the town of Westboro, and I'm joined today by Samantha or Sam Randall, a developer with Randall & Co., and then Brittany Gessner, an engineer with VHB. Together, we're going to walk you through what the development process really looks like from three distinct but connected perspectives as the planner, myself, the developer, Sam, and Brittany, the engineer. And then our goal today is to shed some light on the behind the scenes work, the decision points, and the collaboration that it takes to bring a development project from an idea to a reality. So get it through the permitting process. But before we dive into some serious stuff, I do want to start with a joke because who doesn't like a good joke? And I felt like this joke had some good response at the CPTC conference in March. Okay, so a planner, a developer, and an engineer walk into a bar, and the developer says, "I'll buy the first round, just need to maximize my return on investment." The engineer says, "I'll calculate the optimal beer to foam ratio for efficiency." And the planner says, "Hold on, did anyone check if this bar is zoned for fun?" The bartender sighs and says, "Great, another special permit request." Ugh. Now, I can't take credit for creating this because I did ask my good friend ChatGPT to help me write it. And since this is virtual, I can't tell if anyone's laughing, but I'll assume you are to help my confidence. So thank you. Okay. So the key goals of today's session. First, we're going to demystify how development projects move through the local approval process here in Massachusetts. As most of you know, It's a process that's very complex and layered and is largely shaped by local decision making. And then, unlike some states where a lot of permitting authority is centralized, in Massachusetts, development entitlements are primarily decided at a local level and often by volunteer boards and commissions. And many of those that serve on these boards are your neighbors stepping up to serve, not full-time professionals in the field. Projects usually need approvals from multiple town boards, each with their own process and requirements. And that can make things feel very confusing, even for the people that work in it every day, like us. Many of the boards, we understand, also have limited resources, limited staff support, and varying levels of experience with real estate development. So that's why we felt like this session was a good way to help to understand that. Okay. So I did a brief introduction, but just to go in a little deeper, as I said, I'm Jenny Gingras. I'm currently the Director of Planning for the town of Westboro, where I've been for 2 years. Previously, I was the town planner for Pepperell, Mass. And prior to that, I was the zoning administrator in Lexington, Mass. I've also served on many boards and committees. And then prior to that, I worked as a paralegal in land use and construction law. So I'll hand it over to Sam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Randall. Jenny, thanks for that intro and for the joke. I laughed,
Good.
even though it was my second time hearing it. So I'm the founder and principal of Randall & Co. I founded my company a little over a year and a half ago. So I have over a decade of experience on the development side of the industry. I was previously a vice president of development at National Development in Boston. And most of the projects that I've worked on are in the greater Boston, Massachusetts market, although I am working on one project in Pennsylvania as well right now. But I've delivered a number of complex projects all across different product types. So ranging from multifamily and mixed use, which I would say are probably like my most familiar product types, as well as retail, senior housing, and industrial projects. So I will pass it over to Brittany.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Gessner. I'm a civil engineer with VHB. I've spent my entire career managing multidisciplinary, very complex land development projects across the state. So I handle a lot of the consultant management. So I oversee the teams of civil engineers and surveyors, traffic engineers, landscape architects, and I'm often the point of contact between the design team and the proponent, who would be the developer, the owner, as well as the town and the public. So I've presented in front of dozens of municipalities, planning boards, zoning boards, conservation commissions, and really facilitating that public aspect, that link between the public connection and the design component of a project.
Great. So we will kick off with each of our various perspectives on a development project in general. So the developer's perspective, our primary focus is first to secure any necessary approvals for a project within a land option agreement timeline. This is important because each and every project is so different. So each land option agreement looks completely different as well. And what that means is typically if you can have an owner of a piece of property agree to sell a piece of land to you for development, typically, I mean, they want to usually see it done as fast as possible, and they want to see you put as much money in the form of a deposit up, in high enough increments that it makes sense, but also in various increments of time that makes sense for them. So you have to make sure that if you're entering into an option agreement with a landowner, your approvals will be able to be obtained within a reasonable time frame within that agreement. The other thing, obviously, that a lot of these projects really come down to is financial feasibility, especially in today's uncertain economic climate. Project financials can vary significantly and change significantly over time. So that's something that we're always having to make sure is current and makes sense, and that the project that we're permitting actually makes sense and is financeable from, just from a return on cost perspective. The other thing is managing pre-development costs. So typically we'll put together a pre-development budget that we think encompasses all of the costs required to get a project through entitlements. So that would include your land option agreement payments, as well as paying any necessary consultants to help you design and bring the projects through permitting. Those costs obviously can inflate if you're forced to go through like some sort of extended review timeline for entitlements. The other really important piece, which I'm always a proponent of very early on in the process, is trying to garner community support for your project. I always think that it's better to have these discussions with abutters and key stakeholders in the community early, just so that we can get their feedback and try to incorporate anything that might be important to them within reason into the project that is being proposed. So when we're looking at like what is the goal through the entitlements process, it's to obtain entitlements that allow for the maximum appropriate density per the zoning, to minimize the time frame and the costly conditions and requirements that go into those approvals. And the biggest thing for me is to create predictability of the timeline for entitlements and all of the various steps thereafter for investors and lenders. If you tell an investor or lender that it will take 6 months to obtain approvals and it takes 2 years, many of them may walk and not want to be part of the project anymore, if the project is even financially feasible at that point. So with that, I'm going to move on to a little peek behind the developer's curtain. So what do we actually do beyond getting these projects entitled? So typically when we're looking at a project, we would start with market research. So looking at a general target market. And then if that market is appealing for the product type that we're interested in developing, we would dig into site selection. So trying to figure out which parcels of land are developable in the municipality and what encumbrances may come with those sites, and trying to figure out essentially what can be built there. All of that involves financial modeling of the project. What do you think you can obtain for rents if it's a residential project, or even the same thing on the commercial side? If you were to secure a tenant, how much will they pay? What will the operating expenses look like? What will this project cost to design? And then ultimately, what will you have to pay for the land? I'm also pulling together professional teams of consultants like Brittany to try to help me like design and plan a very thoughtful project on the technical side. So it's super important to me to make sure that the teams that I'm working with are the right teams to pull off these really complex development projects. Community engagement is one I already touched on. So making sure that we're meeting with various community leaders, neighborhood associations, and then key constraints that we have to always weigh is lending and equity investor expectations and requirements, and that those are always inevitably changing based on the interest rate environment, and then construction costs and material availability, which has been a hot one over the last few years. Tariffs is one thing that could probably take another hour of this session if we dug into that, but also just construction cost escalation in general. So those are some key considerations and constraints from my perspective. I will pass it off to Jenny.
Great, thanks, Sam. So how I approach development projects from a planner's perspective, I really think my role is about balancing regulations with the community goals. When I look at a proposal, I'm asking if it complies with our zoning and planning rules and regulations, and then does it align with what the community has said it wants through the master plan, through other planning studies we've done. Through other ways, we have gathered some public input. And then I am also looking at what impact it has on our infrastructure, but also traffic, our schools, again, utilities, town services. I have to think about all of those things when a development project comes forward. So when a developer or engineer that's hired by the developer calls me and says they're interested in building a multifamily or constructing a warehouse in the town, these are questions that I have to have answers for at our first meeting. This is where the applicant comes in, and even before showing any detailed plans, they are presenting a basic concept and they're asking, how will the town feel about this? And I can usually pretty confidently give an answer on how they're going to feel about it based on its location, the type of project. And I can, even if it's allowed by right, I can usually tell them how the neighborhood is going to feel about it and what pushback they could have. My job is to also help applicants navigate the process and to make sure they know what will be required, what to expect, and then how to move through these steps as smoothly as possible. I also want to encourage that projects have value, such as housing diversity, walkable neighborhoods, promoting economic development. So when someone comes in, I am talking to them about these things and trying to get a good project for the town. I'm also looking at risks. This could mean identifying any potential legal issues that we could have. Again, looking at the community concerns. I can tell if a neighborhood is going to give pushback, and I can let the applicant know what to expect and maybe how to get in front of that. And then finally, I support the boards by providing balanced recommendations so that they're able to make an informed decision that's fair, transparent, and also legally defensible. I can, based on what the applicant is giving in their presentation and how the board is feeling, I can kind of get an idea on how to make that decision and make sure that the board is making their decision based on the facts presented in the application. Next slide. So this slide is more about what it actually looks like on the ground from day to day. A big part of my work is shaping how the development will take form in the community, reviewing the projects to ensure they meet both the technical requirements and the town's long-term vision. And again, that vision might come from master plan, a housing production plan, et cetera. So just understanding those plans. Then as a planner, we're constantly working on balancing competing interests. Developers are focused on feasibility. So when a developer or engineer comes in, I can help them to understand if this project is feasible. And I'm honest with them on the timeline, or I try to be based on my expectations of the board. Residents can be more focused on impacts, and then boards are focused on process and policy. So I have to be a connector as a planner and translate all of these different perspectives to help keep this moving forward. So essentially, planners, I think, are problem solvers. We're working with engineers, town departments, legal counsel, applicants, and we're constantly trying to identify and address these issues, hopefully up front, even before they're visible to the public, so that when they get to the planning board or zoning board of appeals stage, that project has already been vetted in the background to make sure it's something that the community will want and meets the rules and regulations.
Great. So an engineer's perspective, I'm often, well, Jenny is the middleman between our development team and the public. I'm often the middleman between the developer and the planner. So my focus is Sam or another developer comes to me with an idea, and I need to help her understand how she can execute that. It's my responsibility to be knowledgeable of the local regulations, the zoning, also the state and federal regulations as well. Is this allowed? How can we get it done? And then in addition to that, how will it work? I need to understand, is it allowed? Can we do this? But then I also need to understand, is this the appropriate place? Can we actually get enough cars in and out of the site? What do the soils look like? Is this the type of site that can support that type of development? My goal is really to help Sam see around the corners. I need to have local boots on the ground. I need to understand the municipality, understand the regulations, and communicate that to Sam and her team in a way that she can understand and make logical decisions. Also, it's important to understand the timing that it takes for these types of projects, and so that Sam can make her decisions, get under her agreements. And if she knows it's going to take 2 years, as long as she knows that up front and she can plan for that. The worst thing is if I tell her, hey, I can do this for you in 6 months, and then it takes significantly longer. There's always unforeseen circumstances, but the goal as an engineer is to help see around corners, understand the things that Jenny's going to be concerned about, and how do we put that into practice. Some of the key risks are regulations that I may not be aware of. So I know there's a lot of planners on this call. I think the more of your regulations, your applications that you can put online to help with that visibility would be extremely helpful to applicant teams. Also being available for those early discussions and those early meetings so that we can collaborate on projects and understand what your hot buttons are, what you're looking for, so that we can plan that into a project early. If you can go to the next slide. So what do I actually do? I actually do a lot of design and calculation. I prepare plans and reports. I observe construction processes to make sure that things are being constructed as we committed to them during the permitting process. But again, in order to make those decisions, it's important to be knowledgeable on a lot of the non-technical items. What is the local permitting climate? What is the neighborhood like? What are the boards and commissions like? What is the market like? Sam may come to me with a project like, we just did a project like this and it's not filling up very quickly. Maybe we should tweak it and think about it a little bit differently. I would say some of the big constraints is, as an engineer, I can make suggestions, I can advise Sam, but ultimately I'm not the decision maker. This is Sam's project as a developer, and all the decisions are up to her, while I can provide advice. That said, as a licensed professional engineer, there are limitations to some of that wiggle room. So I am owning a lot of risk with the design. I am owning a lot of liability. And so it's important that all of my experience goes into some of this advice and some of the decision making, and that I, as an engineer, really own what is shown on the plans and what we're proposing and what we're committing to the public on how this project may function.
Great. So we thought it would be really helpful to come up with a case study to kind of talk through our various perspectives on a real development project. One that we made up, but but that I think is very reminiscent of some projects that we've all worked on. So in this case study, it will be a 150 unit ground up residential building. But the existing structure requires significant remediation followed by demolition, including a demolition delay from a historic commission. And then the full project would require a special permit from the planning board. And one item to note is that there is a 15% inclusionary housing requirement. So I wanted to talk through what my primary concerns and what my approach would be for a project like this one. So timeline pressure is one that I think I already harped on when I spoke previously, which is that in this scenario, we have a 2-year option agreement with a 6-month deposit schedule. So 2 years is really the outside date without extensions, which you can sometimes negotiate for having to actually purchase the land. And that typically, in a scenario like this, would entail like a 6-month deposit schedule where you're putting $50,000 to $100,000 up as a deposit. It's essentially like a nod to the seller that you're willing to spend money and that you're continuing to diligently pursue the entitlements process. Financial viability is one that I'm consistently looking at throughout the life cycle of a project like this. So the things that would stand out to me would be high remediation, demolition, and construction costs for a project of this nature. So just seeing what the markets are doing, what construction costs are doing, are interest rates going up? Another thing is that special permit, as everyone here knows, a special permit is discretionary. So wanting to make sure that any requirements or any conditions that are imposed on the project are reasonable and within, make sense given the scale of the project. Anytime you're undergoing a special permit process, it's up the discretion, the board has the discretion. So it's a bit different from going through something like a site plan review. So from my perspective, each month of a delay in the entitlements process increases your project costs. That's just how the financial pro forma ends up coming together. The other piece, which you would know ahead of time, which is a good thing, is that 15% affordable units, that does impact the financial model, but we also would understand that that's super important to the community and to the municipality. So that's something that I would want to flag and underwrite from the very beginning. So what I would do in this case study is front load all of my technical studies and due diligence. As soon as I entered into an option agreement to purchase the land, I would want to make sure that I understand like the soil conditions, all of the remediation requirements and costs, the demolition costs. So really front loading studies with technical consultants to make sure that I have a good grasp on all of the costs that go into a project like this. I would also want to, you'll see a theme here, but I would want to engage early with the Historic Commission to just make sure that, bringing down a historic building is not something that would be contentious in this scenario. And making sure that we're opening that dialogue very early before we spend, quite frankly, a lot of time and money on a project that may end up not being feasible. That's always my goal with trying to make sure that I'm initiating any relevant discussions as early as I can. I think Brittany touched on this as well, is that even if an entitlements process is not going to be a short one, my biggest goal is to just make sure that it's transparent as to how long that will take. So like if the process if the process is likely to take 2 years, I would want to know that up front just so that I could plan for it. The trouble that I end up, getting into is that like with my investors and other stakeholders is that if I promise someone that a process takes 6 months and it ends up taking 2 years, that just inflates costs and it's just not a great thing for the developer. The other thing that I would like to discuss with a project of this size going through a special permit process is to discuss any mitigation requirements up front so that I can build that into my financial analysis. Jenny.
Great, thanks, Sam. So in this specific project, 150 unit residential development, that's pretty large for a town. I think for most of us that are on this call in a municipality. And so I would definitely want to know about this early on. So most of the time, a developer or the engineer comes in to speak with me about the project, and they have a very rough concept plan that shows where they're thinking about locating it, and they want to know about the zoning. They want to know how the town will feel about it. At that stage, I can also talk to them about things they're going to run up against. So I can look up the project on our GIS map or look it up in our database, and I can say, okay, this is a historic building, as this case study is. So you'll need to go through the historical commission. There's the potential for a demolition delay. With the affordable units, I would also want to make sure the developer and engineer understand upfront if there's going to be any wiggle room on a waiver to the affordable percentage. It is understood that the expense of developing affordable units can be quite high, and we understand that. So just me knowing our master plan or our housing production plan, I can understand our, priorities. Where are we with our subsidized housing inventory? What type of housing, are we missing here? And then I can let them know if the planning board or zoning board would be willing to waive any of that percentage in exchange for something else. So that's the mitigation that Sam was talking about. I also want to make sure they're set up with the engineering department to look at the sewer and water capacity, because this is a large project. We want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding up front about what is there and what they can have. And any expectations from the planning board. Like, I know my planning board in Westboro, we usually ask for a sidewalk or a connection to a trail in the area. And so I would want them to know that up front. So essentially, the first meeting would be looking at the zoning regulations, giving them a heads up on all of these different things, because that is going to be how they further their plans for the project. So the goals, helping them navigate the special permit process. Like, I think it was Brittany that said, having upfront that list of requirements that we have. We have a very specific list of requirements that we want to see on a site plan. And so making sure that the developer engineer just goes through that and checks it off, that we want to see. Addressing the historic preservation concerns. So setting them up maybe to meet with the chair of the historic commission before they meet with the actual board, or just understanding if there will be a delay involved. And then responding to neighborhood concerns. Like I've mentioned before, I can usually tell if a project's going to be near a neighborhood, how is that neighborhood going to feel about it? I always recommend meeting with the neighborhood before it comes in front of the board, because a person is, I feel like they're intimidated when they get a legal notice in the mail that something's happening. So I always recommend upfront, meet with the neighborhood, just have coffee and donuts or something, and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this 150 unit project. What concerns do you have? Getting in front of it. So supporting the developer. We want the review process to be organized. It helps us as staff, and I know it helps them as developer engineer, and then it helps the board. We want to make sure that the project moves through efficiently, and we have as much information as we can so that we can make sure that a good decision is made based on facts. Let's see if there's anything I missed here. Oh, environmental review and, just real quick, environmental review and remediation. That's definitely a huge thing that can potentially delay a development. So just making sure that they sit with the right people in the beginning, have them sit with your conservation agent or whoever with your town staff, and get in front of that early on so that there isn't a problem when you get to the board stage. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. And then from an engineer's perspective, my focus is to design a site that will be functional, cost-effective, innovative, and lawful. So there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of things we're thinking about. For example, Jenny mentioned that the town of Westboro requires that all projects require a sidewalk. Well, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts requires that all projects have an accessible sidewalk to your front door from the public right-of-way, regardless of your existing topography. So that's just one example, but it's something that you really need to identify early on and plan for, and reduce the surprises for the development project down the line. Ultimately, it's my responsibility to make sure that this project will comply with all of the applicable laws and regulations, and that it will function. You know, the worst thing I want to do is design something that doesn't function. You know, it's really seeing around those corners and identifying the long lead items, the big risks early on. And I want to make it cost effective. I want to be innovative. I want it to be interesting and neat, but I want it to fit in with the community, and something that works. I would say big risks for us are fluid regulations. You know, we've been hearing from the state that stormwater regulations are going to change. We've been hearing that every year for the last half a dozen years or so. I think it's coming, but it's something we need to plan for, and it's a similar risk locally. You know, if you guys have town meeting and your zoning changes, the sooner you can get that updated on your website, the much more helpful it is for all of us to make sure we're designing to the latest and greatest. And again, there's always the risk of the unpredictable public review process. But I think anticipating that we're here trying to make something functional and legal, and we're making our best effort to comply with every applicable regulation, is important to consider.
Okay. So common disconnects. One of the most important things that I've learned as a planner is that even when we're all working in good faith, there's always room for opportunities for misunderstandings. So that's why we want to try to get in front of it as much as we can. So this slide just highlights some of the most common disconnects that we see during the development process, and they often come down to differences in perspectives and priorities. So first, timeline expectations. As Sam explained, developers often have financing deadlines, purchase agreements, investor pressure, and they want to move quickly. But then on the municipal side, boards, we have to work through a public process. We have our rules and regulations, we have our requirements, we need to make sure everything's met. They want to deliberate carefully, the boards want to deliberate carefully, gather input, and follow the proper steps. And these two timelines don't always align, and that can definitely create frustration on both sides. But again, by having this communication up front in the beginning, we can help move that process along efficiently and prevent what should be a 2-month board approval process into a 6-month approval process, which we don't want on either side. For financial feasibility, what we might see as a minor change, adding another condition or requiring a redesign, can sometimes make or break a project financially. And it's important to understand that I don't think that's always obvious to boards or the public, how sensitive development performers can be. And so part of my role is helping to bridge that understanding. Technical complexity, engineering challenges, stormwater, utilities, soil conditions, those can be very hard to explain in a public meeting. And if they're not understood, they can seem like excuses or obstacles rather than real design constraints. So it's important that we make sure the applicant, the developer, engineer, and the planner understand what is required up front, so that we don't get to the review process and the project is missing a bunch of things, and then we have to go back and forth. And then that just makes the process even longer. For risk assessment, each stakeholder is focused on a different set of risks. A developer may be concerned with market risk and permitting delays. The town is focused on infrastructure, legal liability. And then you have the public. They're worried about neighborhood impacts or school capacity, as we often hear. All of these concerns are valid, but they don't always align. So again, just making sure we're all on the same page in the beginning. And then finally, community benefit. We all have a different definition of community benefit. A developer may see that the new housing, job creation, tax revenue is a huge benefit to the town, but the town could be on the opposite side. They're looking for open space, infrastructure improvements, affordability, and then residents, as we know, usually just want to preserve what's already there and don't want changed. So it's just understanding that these perspectives aren't wrong, they're different. And how can we work together to, we're not going to make everybody happy. We're not going to give everybody exactly what they want, but we can help connect everything so that, the project works mostly for everybody, and everybody at least is, I wouldn't say happy, but not unhappy.
We're heard.
Heard. There you go. That's a better
Yeah.
one. Everybody's heard.
Yeah. Good segue. So bridging the gap. So how can we better collaborate? Early and frequent communication is always going to be the biggest one that I'm going to harp on. Probably sound like a broken record, but I just feel that it's so important. Can't tell you how many times I've like gone and met with abutters in their living rooms with like just a board showing like a very conceptual site plan and explaining what we want to do. It really goes a long way. Like Jenny said, people don't want to first hear of a project when they're receiving like a legal notice. It just doesn't feel great. Educational workshops. We were so glad to be invited back to present tonight, and we hope to continue to present on topics like these. Setting clear explanations and expectations of constraints is also key. And I think clear communication can solve a lot of these difficulties we may face with our various perspectives on these projects. We should just also focus on our shared goals. I think ultimately, like when it comes down to it, we all want a great project. Like the developer wants it to, lease well. We want to show a great project that's great for the community, that has connectivity, it has good mitigation. So keeping the end shared goals in mind will go a long way. And then another key thing that I find helpful is doing actual site visits at the properties. Like a lot of people, even when it's their own town, don't actually go to a site and walk it and like see the development vision. So site visits themselves, as well as just visual tools, renderings, good like conceptual site plans can go a long way to communicating your vision for a site. And then we'll leave these last questions as sort of like a conversation starter. I think we're really good on time, so we'll have some like about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So these are some things just for you to think about as planners or whatever you may do, or if you're a board member. How can we better improve communication to board members? What resources would be helpful? We want to hear from you on that. You should feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box, and I believe some have already been dropped in, so we'll jump to those in a minute. But the top takeaways. I had to think about this. I think my top takeaway is just, again, the importance of the predictability of the discretionary entitlements processes to allow for proper planning. It's not that they need to be shorter, it's just that they need to be predictable and not drawn out for, 2 times the amount of time that we thought it would take. That would be my biggest takeaway. Jenny?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think from the planning perspective, it's important to balance all of these things, right? Regulatory compliance, community interests, and development feasibility. We can't just focus on one and ignore the others. A project might meet all the zoning requirements, but still fail if it doesn't fit into the context or gain that public support. Second, the public engagement can definitely make or break a project when it's done well. Like Sam was describing with, the visual renderings, things like that, meeting on site, talking early to the staff, that improves the design. It helps surface those issues early, and it really helps to make the project. But when it's done poorly or skipped entirely, it almost certainly always leads to delays, frustration, and then it may lead to failure in the project. So again, the public doesn't need to agree with every detail, but as Sam said earlier, they do need to feel heard and respected.
And then I have just three takeaways that I'd like to mention. The first is, as an engineer stamping construction plans, I am assuming a significant amount of liability for the how this project will function once it's constructed, and then also how it will comply with regulations. So just keeping in mind that there's a lot of experience that goes into the decisions that are made. And then I personally am assuming a lot of liability for what I'm proposing on a project. The second one I want to mention is, as a designer, collaboration only makes a project better. So actually never have I ever submitted a concept to a town and then constructed what was on that concept. It always changes for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it changes a lot, sometimes it changes a little. But we want to hear from the community who lives there, and we want your input. We want you to help us understand what might make the project better, and we want to weave that into the project to the maximum extent practical. And then the third thing that I just want to mention is, we are naturally resistant to change. Change is hard, but change is important to growth. And so I think it's important that to remember, everybody lives in a house, everybody goes to a workplace, and all of that had to have been built at one point or another. We all know of people personally who right now cannot find somewhere to live that they can afford. And so it's important to build places for people to live. It's important to build places for people to go to work, and stuff that was built previously may or may not work for today's world. So change is hard, but growth is good. And if we can work together, I think we can really continue building our communities into a great place we want to live, work, and play.
Well said, Brittany.
Great. So I will stop sharing now so we can answer some questions.
Sam, I think you've got the first one from Annette.
I liked that some people were laughing at your joke, Jenny. I saw a few of those.
Only some.
Oh, Annette.
Jim, thanks, Jim.
Annette, good question. What does 6-month deposit schedule actually mean? Payments every 6 months? Yes. So it's typically that a payment would be due against whatever the ultimate land value is, whatever dollar amount you're paying for the land, you would have to pay a deposit. Like I said, I've seen them vary, but like in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, where you have to pay that much toward the purchase price just to show that you're diligently pursuing the project. So now I will say, sometimes those deposits are refundable at the end of the day if you don't close on the land, but oftentimes they're not, and you would just lose out on that money if you don't purchase the land. So it's risky for developers, and it's a big deal. And they can be structured in various ways, but that's generally what it means.
I could take the next question from Lisa. And maybe we read these questions. I don't know if the participants can see them. But Lisa asks, oh, where'd it go? Are there concerns about investigating known and remediated to the extent possible contaminants on adjacent properties ever? I would say, as far as contamination goes, that's usually governed by what's called the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, MCP. It's generally not regulated locally, but when a developer, even before they go under agreement on a project, the first thing they want to do is complete what's called a Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment, ESA. And what that does is that we will review the history of a project, what's been there, if there's been any reporting. We'll look at that site, and we will also look at abutting sites, and then we'll identify if there's any wrecks on that property that need to be further investigated. And if there are, then maybe we have to prepare what's called a Phase 2 environmental site assessment. Most banks require this, so if there's any debt being taken on as part of the project, this is something that the developer will be required to do. And that investigation often does look around the property. If it's something subsurface, we might have to model groundwater to see what that does to the property. But that's all regulated by the Massachusetts Contingency Plan.
Great. I think the next question how do you balance, oops, it keeps moving, sorry. How do you balance your professional preferences for a project with the perceived preferences of the planning board and the community? So as a planner, it definitely can be a difficult thing, but what I have found is that it's important to refer back to your master plan if you have one, or if you don't, back to a plan or any public outreach that you've done. Because oftentimes you'll find in the master plan, for example, for an affordable housing project, the public outreach was done at that time, the public gave their input and they want to see more affordable housing. And that project in front of you for affordable housing or for a housing project with an affordable component would meet that. And so what we try to do is the board has a finding that this meets the master plan priorities. So just reminding the boards of that, putting it in a memo format, I find that that's really helpful to just point them back in the direction of what the public said during that master planning process.
The next one, I think any of us can answer, but it says, how much influence can the public really have on a residential subdivision? That's the property owner's right per the subdivision control law. And for this example, if it's a project by right, then you're really reviewing against the local regulations that are in place. So for example, if they're looking to connect to town sewer, is there capacity to support that project, or are they handling sewer on site? So if a project is by right, it's not as subjective of an approval, but there are opportunities to ensure that they meet your design standards. For example, under subdivision, you as a municipality will have your own subdivision regulations, and so you can determine how wide the roads need to be, you know, how much landscaping you might need to have, how many trees. So you should have put in place regulations that will guide the development, but you may not have the ability to deny it. And even with a special permit, I mean, there are criteria where you can approve and deny something, and those decisions really should not be subjective. They should be determined against the identified criteria.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on my end is I have worked on so many different projects, and I would say the majority of the projects that I've worked on are not by right and not site plan review. They typically have to undergo some sort of discretionary permitting process. So the reality is most projects in Massachusetts at least require some sort of discretionary permits. That's just been my experience.
Yeah, and so a subdivision would still have to go through the permitting process, of course, and they can be appealed by the public. So it's important to still have that input early on. The developer, I suppose, because it's by right, they technically don't have to listen to any of it. But again, you know, they probably want to avoid the appeal process. And so just by adding little things and having those conversations up front with the neighborhood that the subdivision is going into, you know, maybe they want to see more trees as screening. Maybe they'd be happy if there's a sidewalk put in. Just getting in front of those things, I think will really help the project to move along more efficiently. Where are we with questions?
The
So
next question is about grant funding. Where does grant funding come into the development process? I'm thinking of site acquisition and development funds from CDBG and Community One Stop for Growth. Is that primarily a developer, financial issue, or as the name suggests, does it require input from the community? The one component I would offer to this is most state grants do require some sort of public ownership. Sam and I actually spent a lot of time on this on a specific project earlier this year. But it's important that if grants are being pursued, there's some sort of public or nonprofit ownership. So whether that's a roadway or something that is owned by you know, a local housing authority, or if there is a dilapidated site that's ideal for or identified as a priority development site, if it can go into town ownership before going to development, that will help the pursuit of a grant. But that's one very critical component to grant pursuits.
Yeah, I would also say that they typically have pretty strict like deadlines. So, and oftentimes it's only, once per year that you can apply for some of them, not all of them. So, wherever that fits into your project timeline as a developer, you sort of have to be nimble, and never count on it, quite frankly. Like if you can secure grant funding, which is very competitive today, it's really like a bonus. And it's maybe you can do a more robust public realm improvement or something with those funds that you otherwise wouldn't be able to afford in the project financials. So the timing can vary, but oftentimes it depends on the funding deadlines.
And I'll just add, for grants such as the MassWorks grant, where you need a developer to partner up essentially for the grant application. You should know ahead as a town what you would like to see from that developer, or at least have an idea of it, and that can be through your capital projects or your capital plan. So if you want to see a road improved and now you have a developer coming in and they're going to build something on that road, you're prepared and ready at that early meeting to talk to the developer and find out if they're interested in assisting with that. Okay. Who typically prepares the application packet for a project? Drawings, narratives, etc., the engineer or the developer?
So it's both, but I would say the engineers often do a lot of the heavy lifting. So like I would hire Brittany's group to write the full document, and they typically would send it in draft form to the developer, who then mostly would edit or amend the narrative piece of it. But I would say like Brittany's firm, VHB specifically, like they'll basically put the whole thing together for you with all of the various technical components integrated into it. I think
That's what I do.
some
That's what I
developers
do
are
all day
probably,
long on behalf
yeah,
of Sam.
right. And
So
some
I'm doing it
developers
on
are more,
behalf of the applicant.
mhm. Um, so I mean, myself as a developer, like I typically read everything and I like will mark it up, but some developers are probably more hands-off, I would say. What ways might a developer work with the public to improve their view of a project, such as traffic improvements or amenities? Um, so I would say like, well, at least for the traffic improvements, these conversations are typically most beneficial to have as part of like mitigation discussions early on. So we would be leaning on the local experts, so like Jenny and her engineers, or people at the municipality that know the area best to determine like what might be a feasible and also fair mitigation for the project at the scale that we're proposing it. So I've seen a traffic signal be incorporated into a project as mitigation. That's probably a more extreme situation, or, extending sidewalks, making an area more walkable. Brittany, Jenny, do you want to throw any other things out there that you've seen?
Yeah, those are good examples. I mean, typically we even will ask for a contribution of funds towards something because it might not make sense for a sidewalk, for example, to be built on a portion of where the development's going to be, when we might have a bigger plan of developing a sidewalk along that whole stretch. So sometimes in lieu of the actual physical improvement, we'll say, can you contribute funds instead? So that's just another way to look at it. Okay. Any experience on enforcing developer to complete a development when they've become in default other than through the legal process of the bond or covenant? Sam, do you?
I think that's the only means by which you can go after a developer. I mean, luckily, I've never been in that scenario. Like even at my previous firm, like I've never been in a scenario where like the developer was in default and couldn't perform under perform their obligations. So I think a bond or covenant is the only way to handle it legally, as far as I know.
The only thing I would add, and it depends on what stage the project is at, but we add conditions even to our site plan reviews for by right projects. They still go through a site plan review, and we have a condition that mirrors the Mass General Law 3-year window to initiate a construction project. So that's required under Mass General Law for special permits, but it's not for site plan reviews. So we as a board add that on. Otherwise, we have found that, you have a site plan review, it's technically in place forever, that decision. And we don't, things might change over the years or whatnot. And we want to make sure that we have a time frame on that development.
And then the
Okay.
last question is, do you try to consolidate local permitting, i.e. Planning Board, Conservation Commission, DPW, in one process and or using the same consultants town-wide? I would say it would be the most efficient process if you can use the same set of documents to apply for all entitlements at once. That is typically what I recommend. That is my preference, especially because, and I have seen municipalities where they say, oh, you have to go to planning board before you come to Concom, which that's fine. But if I go to planning board and they want certain changes and I change it like that, and then I go to, and I close that process, and then I go to Concom and they want changes, and now that changes planning board, then I have to go back and it sort of becomes a chicken and the egg. And so I would highly recommend, and I greatly appreciate it when municipalities are supportive of getting local reviews concurrently. So that everything can be streamlined and efficient so that we can all get through this process and continue on with what we're trying to achieve.
Right. And then just to add on to that, the peer review, if you're sending something out for peer review, it's much easier for everyone to just use the same peer reviewer, the same company for conservation, for planning, or whichever board. It's easier for the applicant. It's easier for you as a planner or staff. It just makes the process more efficient. We do always say you can apply to those boards simultaneously. And that's one of the things as a planner I have to juggle is, where's conservation with the hearing? Where's planning with the hearing? But again, just communicating and then keeping the same peer reviewer. That would be my response to making that move efficiently. Okay, any more questions?
We've successfully navigated till the 6 o'clock hour. I want to say thank you to all the presenters. I certainly appreciate your time and expertise on this. And thank you to all the attendees on behalf of CPTC for taking time to listen to this session and weigh in with your questions.
Great, thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thanks for having us.
All right,
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Bye.
night.